Hi, everyone, and welcome. And thank you so much for joining the ACISTE Community Conversation with Steve Taylor and the pandemic as a spiritual emergency, spiritual experience, an awakening process. And what is this process like for you? So before we get started today, I want, for those of you that are not familiar with ACISTE and maybe joining us for our community conversation webinars for the first time, who ACISTE is and what we do. ACISTE stands for the American Center for the Integration of Spiritually Transformative Experiences. And we provide support for people who've had nonlinear, non-ordinary states of consciousness experiences. There are many terms for the types of experiences and the many, many different ways that that spiritually transformative experience can occur. So we kind of lumped them all into that one term, spiritually transformative experiences. We provide support, free support for experiencers through an online private forum, through small support groups, through information and videos on our website, and also on our YouTube channel, which you can find under just our acronym ACISTE, A-C-I-S-T-E, on YouTube. My name is Elizabeth Sabet, and I am the board president of ACISTE, and very happy and grateful to be serving this way. And Katrina Michelle is with us today, our executive director. Katrina is a holistic psychotherapist in the New York City area. Katrina, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, I'm really happy we were able to put this together today. I think that it's an important time to be having this conversation. And we are really grateful for Steve Taylor to be joining us. Steve is let's see, I'm going to read your bio here. Steve is the author of several best-selling books on psychology and spirituality, and is a senior lecturer in psychology at Leeds Beckett University. He is currently the chair of the Transpersonal Psychology section of the British Psychological Society. His books include Waking from Sleep, The Fall, Out of the Darkness, Back to Sanity, The Calm Center, and The Leap, The Psychology of Spiritual Awakening. His books have been published in 20 languages, and Eckhart Tolle has described his work as an important contribution to the shift in consciousness which is happening on our planet at present. His new book, Spiritual Science: Why Science Needs Spirituality to Make Sense of the World, was published in September of 2018. His articles and essays have been published in over 40 academic journals, magazines, and newspapers, including Philosophy Now, The Psychologist, the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, and the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. Steve writes a popular blog, Out of the Darkness, for Psychology Today magazine, and he's currently joining us today from Manchester, I believe. Thanks.
That's right. Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, we're very happy to have you, and very honored. Somebody who is both a researcher and also speaking very generally to the public about your work. So we're really happy to have you here as we build the bridge of understanding. And this is certainly a time that's unique for civilization. And I thought it was interesting that you had contributed an article to ACISTE a number of years ago about collective awakening. So you came to mind as somebody we should talk to right now. So anyway, I read your bio. Is there anything else you'd like to add, just to give people a sense of yourself?
Not really. Maybe only that that I have a kind of personal spiritual path too. I investigate spirituality from a psychological point of view, from an academic point of view, but I also investigate it from an experiential point of view. So that's kind of like the grounding of my work, is my own personal spiritual experience.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. That's good to know. I'm curious if you would give us a little bit of a background as to how you came to be focused on this research around spiritual awakening.
It came originally from my own experiences. When I was about 16 years old, I began to have what I now realize are spiritual experiences, but which at the time I didn't understand. So they were experiences in which I'd feel a sense of connection to my surroundings. I'd be walking through the park and everything would suddenly seem to be alive around me, and I'd be filled with a sense of elation, a sense of meaning. as if the whole world around me had become conscious and sentient somehow. But at the time, I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought it was crazy because I didn't understand these experiences. I knew that I couldn't talk about them, that other people would think I was crazy. So it was only when I was in my early 20s, I discovered books about mysticism and spirituality. And I thought, hey, you know, these are the kind of experiences I've been having. So suddenly I had a framework to make sense of my own experiences. And I thought, maybe I'm not crazy after all, or maybe I am crazy, but other people are crazy too. You know, all these other people are crazy too, which is okay. So yeah, once I had a framework to make sense of my experiences, it was very, you know, that gave me a strong sense of confidence. And I wanted to understand these experiences too. I wanted to go into psychology to try to investigate these experiences. So that's always been the main theme of my research in psychology. I want to investigate what I call awakening experiences or spiritual experiences, both on a temporary basis, you know, when they last for a few minutes or a few seconds, there's a sudden glimpse of a more intense world of meaning and aliveness. But also when people undergo a permanent transformation, when they undergo a sudden shift into a new state of being. So I've always wanted to understand those experiences, to find out what's happening. Why do these experiences occur? What are the characteristics of these experiences? Are they always spontaneous and accidental, or is there something we can do to bring them on? So yeah, it's really rooted in my own experiences.
Wonderful. And wonderful that you've been able to help us develop a context for talking about it and sharing it with one another. I think that's so critical.
Yeah, I get a lot of emails from people, especially after my book, The Leap, was published. I get a lot of emails from people practically, you know, every week saying, oh, you know, thanks for your book. It's given me a context to make sense of my own experiences. I used to think I was crazy. So in a sense, is what happened to me originally when I thought I was a bit crazy. And I found a context. So, yeah. You know, I think you can't underestimate the importance of finding a framework to make sense of non-ordinary experiences. That's what I found.
Absolutely. Well, as we get started with our conversation here with Steve Taylor, if anybody watching has a question that you'd like to pose, please drop it in the Q&A box. You'll find that at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will get to that. So, like Elizabeth mentioned, today we're talking about the pandemic as spiritual emergency, and we're looking at the transformational process of crisis and turmoil, which has been a key point in Steve's work. So Steve, I wonder if you can start us off by perhaps letting us know how you're understanding everything the world is going through right now.
It's a crisis. But as we know, every crisis brings an opportunity. There's always a positive underside to every seemingly negative situation. So on one level, I think of the lockdown, or this period of confinement. It's a period of inner growth. You know, it's a period where we can turn inwards. We can move away from the external world. And because you know, many people lose themselves in the external world. We're so busy in our lives, rushing from appointment to appointment, filling our lives with activities and ambitions, that we lose touch with our internal selves, with our authentic selves. So now that, you know, the external world has quietened down and we're forced to enter our own inner space, to explore our own inner space, that is, you know, that equates to, potentially anyway, it's a period of spiritual growth. Interestingly, I've recently been doing some research on spirituality in prisoners. And I found that awakening experiences and also transformational experiences where a person shifts into a different state of being, they're much more common in prisoners than in the general population. So I was thinking about, well, what is it about life in prison which has this kind of spiritual potential? And one thing is that prison is a situation where there is very little activity. You know, you're alone. People are in solitude a lot of the time. Even though the external environment is often quite noisy and turbulent, they're forced to enter their own inner space and to explore their own being. And for a lot of people, that's torturous. You know, it's painful to explore their own being. But for some people, it's an opportunity to really come to know themselves in an authentic way. And it's an opportunity for the innate spirituality to manifest itself. It's also about letting go as well. I think the other big factor about prison life is that you lose your sense of identity. You know, in ordinary life, our identity is made up of roles that we play, attachments to certain, you know, external things like possessions, or to status and success, to ambitions and so on. So when all those are taken away, your identity often collapses because there's nothing to uphold it anymore. And again, for a lot of people, that's a painful experience. I think for everybody, it's a painful experience, but for some people, it's also an opportunity for transformation. Because when your normal identity dissolves away, when your normal ego dissolves away, then in some people, a latent higher self, a latent spiritually awakened self will emerge, you know, and fill the space where the old identity used to be. So I think, again, that happens in prison sometimes. And I think that can happen now in the lockdown period, you know, as a result of letting go of our roles, letting go of our attachments.
Yeah. Katrina, I'd like to ask Steve a question. You know, for many of us who are used to having a spiritual practice, and we practice silence and go on silent retreats, or maybe are introverts or empaths, this time of lockdown has been a kind of a sense of a guilty relief, and where the world is quieter, the energy of, at least in the beginning when everything was locked down, even though there was fear and, you know, uncertainty, some people were experiencing this sense of, like I said, that guilty relief and not feeling the busyness of the world. And we're having to deal with that feeling of guilt, knowing other people were suffering while they were enjoying the silence. And they had a valid reason to say, no, I really don't want to participate in that. I'm in lockdown, or I'm isolating right now. But as you said, for others, it is very difficult. It's not a normal process for them, right? And so what advice do you have for people who really are struggling with the sense of isolation, or the felt experience of isolation, and they're just not used to it?
To some degree, I think it's a question of habituation, because in ordinary life, we're so unaccustomed to spending time with our own minds. We're so unaccustomed to exploring our own mental space because we live so externally, particularly, you know, in the age of social media, where there's always something to focus your attention outside yourself. So it's a bit like you know, for some people, the inner world, if you want to call it that, is a terra incognito. You know, it's unknown territory, and it makes people feel nervous. That's why it's a bit like, you know, a lot of people, when they meditate for the first time, they find it uncomfortable because they're not used to spending time with their own thoughts. They often encounter the disturbance of their own thoughts for the first time. But in the same way that once you explore an unknown territory, you begin to feel at home there. You know, you get a sense of orientation, a sense of space. You begin to feel a sense of familiarity. That will happen with our own beings as well. The more time we spend exploring our own beings, the more at home we will begin to feel. And it's a bit like the surface of the ocean. You know, the surface of the ocean is turbulent, It's full of swelling and roaring waves, the roar, the noise, and the motion of the waves. But underneath the surface of the ocean, you're suddenly in the midst of stillness. So I think when people feel a sense of disturbance through exploring their own being, it's a bit like encountering the surface of the ocean. So the surface of our minds are often quite turbulent. But once you go beneath the surface, you're suddenly in the midst of stillness. So I would say to people that, just stay with it, learn to feel comfortable within your own psyche. And at a certain point, you'll touch into the stillness underneath the surface, underneath the turbulent surface of your mind.
Thank you. It seems that it takes a lot of time to get to that place, though. It takes something to be able to sit there and get comfortable enough with the discomfort of the mind to actually have that eventually that experience of dropping down into stillness. What would you suggest to people when that noise, the surface noise, is too uncomfortable? What would you recommend at that point for them? What is a practice for them?
I would recommend finding a place within their own minds where they can observe the turbulence. It's a bit like to use another metaphor. Sorry, I like using metaphors, but it's like that, like a riverbank. If you can sit on the riverbank, you can watch the river flow by, and not be carried away by the river. You can watch it from a point of stillness. And it's the same with our own minds. If you can find a place within your own mind where you can watch your own thoughts, then you won't be affected by the negativity and disturbance of your own thoughts. So I would suggest that if you are in a mood of calmness, if you're in a situation where you feel at ease and feel relaxed, then close your eyes for a few moments and try to find a still place within yourself where you can just sit back and just watch your thoughts pass by, just like you're sitting on a riverbank watching the river flow by. And if you can do that in a calm and relaxed state, then you can also learn to do it in an agitated state, when your mind is more turbulent than normal. So I think the moments of calmness and relaxation, they can be really useful. They're a really good stepping point from which you can learn to be within your own mental space.
Thank you. That's beautiful. That practice of getting familiar with what that feels like when it's naturally there in your conscious mind. To recognize, to notice. So you're telling people to notice when they are calm, when they're having a moment of calm and contentment, and then be present and notice that and what that's like. It's almost like it gives the body a felt experience of it, and maybe like holding it in their memory, remembering what that feels like, so they have that to go to as a reference point. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a bit like if you're feeling relaxed sitting in your garden, if you have a garden, if it's a sunny day, you can just lie down and just bask in the sunshine, feeling relaxed, feeling the wind against your skin. So that's a really good chance to close your eyes and to just feel comfortable within your own body and within your own mind. And if you can do that, if you can get used to doing that in pleasant circumstances, then you can also learn to do it in negative circumstances, on a cloudy, miserable day.
Yes, and I guess that brings us to where we are now. There's a lot of cloudy, miserable days, right? There's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unemployment. People are really struggling with human needs. And to refer back again to that article you wrote for our newsletter in 2017, you spoke about the 4 signs of collective awakening. And the final one was this sudden psychological turmoil. And it seems that that's where many of us are at the moment, many coping better than others. But I wonder if you could speak to that psychological turmoil that's happening on the global level in many ways, and how you see that as an opportunity.
Sorry, 1 second, I have to turn off my phone, sorry.
Say to Steve besides us.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
So as I mentioned before, in my research as a psychologist, I found that psychological turmoil is the biggest single trigger of sudden spiritual awakening. So that sometimes happens with a bereavement, for example, maybe a diagnosis of cancer. Or it could be just a general sense of stress, a general sense of loss or stress in your life. It could also be addiction, you know. But intense psychological turmoil, it always has a positive, a certain degree of transformational potential. But for many people, it's simply a painful experience which breaks down their self and just fills them with a sense of loss and a devastating sense of emptiness. But for some people, for reasons which aren't really clear, there are some people who seem to have an innate self, higher self, which is ready to emerge, a bit like a chick which is ready to emerge from an egg. And in some people, when their normal ego self breaks down, then this higher self suddenly unfolds inside them. It suddenly emerges. Again, just like a chick being born or a phoenix arising from the ashes. And in many cases, people don't really understand what's happened to them, because it happens to a lot of people who don't know anything about spirituality. So initially, they feel different. They feel that their anxieties have suddenly left them. They feel a sense of connectedness. The whole world seems beautiful and alive to them. They feel an intense sense of compassion, a sense of connectedness to other people. But they don't really understand what's happened to them, so they're slightly confused as well. And after a while, the confusion can actually grow more intense, particularly if they try to explain what's happened to other people. And other people are confused. They don't understand it either. Other people think they're a bit crazy. Eventually, they begin to think that they're a bit crazy too, and the confusion builds up, the frustration builds up. But eventually, people do gravitate towards spiritual books or spiritual teachers, spiritual practices, and they do build up a framework to make sense of what's happened to them. And it's almost like they sometimes describe it as having a completely different identity. They're in the same body, but they feel like a different person in the same body. So I recently did some research with addicts, recovering alcoholics and drug addicts who'd undergone this awakening. And it always happened at the point where they'd literally lost everything. When they were on the brink of suicide. Sometimes they actually attempted suicide. But it was the point where there was nowhere else to go. Everything had fallen away. All of their identity had just collapsed. All of their lives had dissolved away. And then they'd undergo this sudden shift for no apparent reason that they could explain. And the craving to drink or take drugs suddenly left them and never returned. And they felt different. They didn't understand it, but they felt different somehow. They felt like different people. One woman said that she looked in the mirror and didn't recognize herself. She thought, who's that person? I don't recognize that person. And these people sometimes go to AA meetings or Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and they feel a bit guilty because other people seem to be struggling to stay sober. But they don't have any problems because they've become a different identity. They've become literally different people. And so the addiction has faded away with their old selves. The addiction has died as their old self has died. So yeah, it kind of illustrates the amazing transformational potential of suffering. And as we're all going through, collectively, we're going through a period of suffering at the moment, a very challenging period. And there is a lot of transformational potential in it, as in any period of suffering.
Mhm. Yeah, I wonder if there are some thoughts as to how we can guide people toward the transformational potential of this time rather than focusing on the fear and the unknown and the loss. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I found that the most important thing in transformation in relation to suffering is, well, two things really: acknowledgement and acceptance. Because I mean, everybody goes through intense suffering at some point in their lives. You know, it's the nature of life is that it involves suffering. But obviously, only a small minority of people undergo this kind of transformation that we're talking about. So one thing which differentiates the people who undergo the transformation from others is that they have an attitude of openness towards the situation. They, you know, a lot of people when they're suffering, they resist it. They refuse to accept the situation. They may even, you know, refuse to think about it. For example, if somebody is diagnosed with cancer, it could be that they just divert their attention from thinking about it. So I would suggest that in this time, we need to practice an attitude of acceptance. You know, we need to forget about how our lives used to be and about the things that we have lost or that have been taken away from us at the moment. And we need to accept, well, let go of any resistance to the situation and approach it with an attitude of acceptance and with an attitude of mindfulness.
Yes, well said. That was the subject of my dissertation, was the role of resistance. And when it comes to letting go of the resistance, it's easier said than done sometimes to work from that point of acceptance and surrender.
Yeah. What was the context of your dissertation?
It was looking at how the various ways that we resist our spiritual emergence process and what that looks like and what function it might serve. And so, yeah, I mean, my takeaway was that there is a defensive function of resistance, right? That we'll give as much as we're ready to, and until we're ready to completely surrender.
Yeah, I think it's partly because the old ego does not want to give way. You know, it does not want to die. I mean, nobody wants to die. Nothing wants to die. So the resistance is really the old ego trying to maintain itself.
Yeah.
So if you can get around that, then the old ego begins to dissolve away. And that leaves a space, that opens a space for a latent higher self to emerge.
Yeah. I do love this idea of the latent higher self, right? That's really there beneath all of this.
Yeah, it does seem to be, you know, in so many people, you know, a lot of people who don't know anything about spirituality, as I said before, in situations of intense suffering, when the ego breaks down, this latent higher self, it just seems to be waiting to emerge. It's very strange. I've not really got to the bottom of it. It's a very strange phenomenon.
Yeah, and it makes you think, right, now that we're all going through this process together in so many ways, what if all of these latent higher selves began to emerge simultaneously? We would have a whole new culture.
Yeah, well, going back to evolution, that's what I think is happening. Slowly, I think this latent higher self is emerging within the human race. You know, I'm flabbergasted. Do you have that word in America, flabbergasted? Yeah.
Word.
I thought maybe just an English word. But yeah, I'm flabbergasted by the number of people I encounter who undergo this transformation. You know, people contact me all the time to say that they've undergone this transformation. And I think it's much more common than most of us realize, mainly because a lot of the people who undergo it don't know anything about spirituality. They don't tell anybody about it because they don't really understand it. So I think there are possibly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people around the world who've secretly undergone this transformation without telling other people. And it does suggest to me that it is the next phase in human evolution. This latent higher self seems to be naturally unfolding within the human race as a whole. And it is literally a higher self. It's a higher self in the sense that people live much more selflessly, much more altruistically, with a greater sense of connection, with a much more global outlook, in a state of increased well-being and authenticity. So in every way, it's a much more expansive self.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's helpful to put it in that context. I think a lot of time people who don't consider themselves spiritual shy away from talking about it because that word spiritual doesn't have meaning for them, or they don't like the meaning it does have for them. But the way you qualified that, I think everyone can relate to.
Yeah, I mean, it does most frequently happen outside the context of spirituality or of traditional spirituality.
Right.
You know, I've done a lot of research on what I call awakening experiences, which are temporary experiences of awakening, which maybe last for a few seconds, a few minutes, a few hours, maybe. I've looked into the triggers of those experiences or the context where they occur. And I found that it's quite rare for them to occur in a traditionally spiritual context. They normally occur in the midst of everyday activities, you know, such as walking in the countryside, swimming in a lake, dancing, singing, playing music, and so forth, and also psychological turmoil. Well, you know, so, and often meditation too, but in most cases they occur spontaneously, seemingly spontaneously, in everyday situations.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so we have a few questions that are coming in. We have a question coming from T. Claire, and T wants to know, do you think that people will continue to stay woke do you think that people will continue to stay woke rather than go back to business as usual after the pandemic?
Good question. I think something will linger. You know, usually what happens in terms of development is that once you attain a higher level of integration, it usually remains, it doesn't usually go back to the previous level. Once a higher level of complexity has been reached, it tends to remain. So I think that something will linger on. I think there will be a sense of, even within communities, I think there will be a sense of connectedness which will remain. I think one of the great things about, well, I shouldn't really say a great thing, but one of the positive effects of crises such as these is that they bring a new sense of community. They integrate communities more. You know, they bring out cooperation and kindness and generosity within communities. And that usually remains. Maybe it fades away to some degree, but there's a new level of integration which remains. So yeah, I do think that something will remain after the pandemic.
That alone is just so refreshing to have somebody name. So yeah, okay. And the fact that it's about the integration, I wonder how we can ensure that we are all integrating this in the midst of our quarantines and many places coming back to life right now.
Yeah, but you know, people are naturally cooperative. We are naturally altruistic. I think there is a kind of veneer of selfishness and self-centeredness which arises from social conditioning or from habituation. But I think fundamentally, human beings are generally cooperative and altruistic. So we will take any opportunity to express unnatural altruism, I think. And once it's been expressed, it will remain to some degree.
Well, it does sound optimistic.
It does sound optimistic. It's interesting that there is a shift in the way that human beings are perceiving themselves. You know, we used to perceive ourselves as selfish, individualistic, competitive, greedy. But now, in academia and amongst scientists and philosophers, a new picture is emerging, you know, which is that human beings are not really intrinsically selfish or competitive or individualistic. We're actually innately cooperative and altruistic. and even kind. So that's it's kind of an emerging trend over the last few years in academia and philosophy, which is a positive, you know, a more optimistic view of human nature is emerging, I think.
Yes, we were kind after all. Look at that. I love
Yeah.
it. So, okay, we have a few questions from people who'd like to come on camera. Elizabeth, do you want to help them come on?
Yep.
I'm just going to turn my light on, by the way. It's getting dark, isn't it, in my room?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. We're bringing on Edward now. He'll be coming on and asking his question on camera. Hi, Edward. Thanks for joining us today.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Edward.
And just a quick introduction of Edward. He is one of our Experiencer Forum moderators. So we're glad to have you here today, Edward.
Thank you.
Yes. And your question today?
So I guess I'm along the path of non-duality and the loss of self, and you spoke about that, which I'm very interested and curious in. I went through an event in my life a long time ago where I began to speak intuitively, and I realized that I was losing control. Things were happening beyond, spontaneity you're talking about, but that I distinctly remember that I was no longer in control of even myself. And as the systems kind of dismantle and there's a little gap, there's still something trying to pull everything together as opposed to letting it all fall apart. I guess my question is then, how do you become comfortable with losing control of yourself and just learning how to trust that everything will work out even within yourself? Because it's a very powerful experience to feel like you're dissolving and you're losing a sense of coherence in how everything works.
It's, as you say, it is a question of trust. And I think the resistance comes from the ego, because the ego doesn't want to die. It wants to remain in control. And it's fighting to remain in control. So you have to be trustful that there is something else which will, maybe won't assume control, but it will ensure that everything is fine. There will be something else which replaces the ego. I mean, the question of no self is a tricky one, because I wouldn't say that a spiritual awakening is so much a question of no self. I would say it's probably a question of new self rather than no self, but a completely different kind of self, a self that maybe doesn't have a center like our normal self does. And a self which is much more integrated and connected to other human beings and to the world around it. A self which is really so subtle that you may not even notice it's there. So it may seem like no self, but I think there is still some kind of very subtle self there. So I think this subtle new self will assume control. Maybe control is a wrong word, but it will ensure that life flows through you in a positive and healthy way. So yeah, I would say, trust in the process of letting go and just allow a higher subtle self to manifest itself through you.
What does that feel like? So I feel like, thinking about it doesn't seem to be the right answer. So how do you feel into that process of releasing and letting go?
It's I can have an opening, an expansion. It's an opening where you realize that something else is flowing through you. That something that you don't have to consciously direct. I think when we're in the kind of egoic mode, there's a feeling of constrictedness, a feeling of narrowness. And that's why we feel stressed, because it's so narrow, it's so constricted. We feel agitated. But if you allow this higher self to flow through you, there's a sense of, you can sort of relax and allow it to flow through without consciously directing it. And you know, if you trust in the process, you feel assured that you will be guided in the right direction, that you will respond in a natural, a positive way to anything that occurs in your life. So yeah, it's a feeling that you're no longer consciously in control, and you know, you can observe what's flowing through you, but you don't necessarily direct it. And you become more intuitive, more creative, because more stuff is flowing through you through the opening, if that makes sense. And you feel more connected to other people as well, because you feel more empathic, more compassionate, because you know the same source which is flowing through you also manifests itself in other people. So there's a sense of connection to other people.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, Edward. So, okay, we have another question from John Lee. And John is saying that he talks with many friends that are doing quite well. They're actually thriving with the world situation. And they're very reluctant to share this with others who are having a difficult time. So do you have any guidance or thoughts about that?
I would suggest sharing, you know, without fear, as long as you frame it in a compassionate way, in case, so that you don't offend people who may be undergoing difficult times. But it seems to me that it's similar to, you know, when I began to do research on spiritual experiences or awakening experiences, I found that people were always reluctant to talk about them. In some cases, they'd never told anybody about them before because they were afraid of being thought of as strange or crazy. But once people began to talk about them, they felt a sense of release, and people realized that they're not actually so uncommon after all. And maybe it's similar to that. I think the fact that many people are feeling the positive effects of the lockdown or the period of confinement, you know, it suggests that there is no reason to feel afraid of sharing it with them. You know, as long as you are compassionate as well. I think people always sense that when you are compassionate. If you are a compassionate person, it's always tangible. You know, other people can always sense it. So, you know, if you can express your compassion as well, there shouldn't be any problem, I don't think.
Thank you. That's, I think, really good to keep in mind. Having compassion for everyone and their unique responses right now. We're all coming from different places. We all have different support systems and traumas and triggers. And yeah, staying in your heart, being honest about where you are, but really respecting where others may be, I think is a really good point. Maintaining compassion. Okay, so I believe we have Yolene Stout who is going to come on and ask a question, Elizabeth.
Yes, we're bringing her on. Can you see us, Yolene? Or?
I can see you.
Okay, all right, great.
I hope the background noise, I've got a lot of background noise going on, some drilling outside, but hopefully that doesn't interfere.
No,
I have been.
you're fine.
Okay.
And just to introduce Yolene, let me introduce you, Yolene. Yolene is the founder of ACISTE. And so while we don't have her on camera, she is on her phone. We're so glad that you joined us today, Yolene. And I know that you've got a question for Steve.
Yeah, Steve, I'm really delighted with your research, and I've been captivated by everything you've said. I find it so useful to what ACISTE is doing and what we're about in everything from the experience and your advice and integration. It's so so important. I hope we stay closely connected with us.
Yeah.
Because it's very important that we get the data and information about this and keep spreading the word so it becomes mainstream.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, my main question is an area I haven't seen much research on and would like to see us look at is there some kind of readiness factor to spiritual experiences? You talked about the psychological turmoil and the being the midst, but I'm wondering also what I've seen other people talk about too is there's a questioning. There seems to be like a questioning of life's purpose or the value of life, or seeking a higher power, seeking some other some kind of, and maybe not actually even seeking, but just wondering about the purpose in life. Deeply questioning it. I'm wondering if that's part of this psychological turmoil, and if having an experience is sort of this readiness factor for us.
Possibly. I think there are probably two different cases or two different types of spiritual awakening that we can talk about here. I think there are some people who seem to be innately awakened. They seem to be born with a higher self. And their difficulty is in understanding and accepting it. Because we're born into, most of us, particularly in the Western world, are born into cultures which don't accept or support spiritual experience. If somebody has a kind of innate spirituality, a natural higher self, which is trying to express itself, and if they repress it because of their cultural conditioning, because they're afraid of being seen as crazy, or just because they don't understand themselves, then that can cause a lot of psychological disturbance. And eventually it can cause depression, maybe even suicidal depression. But eventually those people will reach a point where their natural wakefulness will manifest itself. They usually, in almost every case that I've been aware of, eventually they always reach a point where they do understand and accept themselves, and where their awakening does manifest itself. So their psychological turmoil comes from the repression of their innate spirituality. So in a sense, they are ready, they are born ready to awaken. They are already awakened, if you like. But other people, you know, they don't seem to necessarily have an innate wakefulness inside them. They accept kind of consensus reality. They live a fairly normal life until they go through intense psychological turmoil, maybe a bereavement, maybe a diagnosis of cancer. And then they undergo an awakening process when their ego self dies away and a new self arises inside them. But the question of readiness is probably important there, because it is almost as if there is a kind of deeply hidden higher self which is latent inside them and which is ready to emerge when it gets the opportunity to. Whereas other people, you know, go through intense turmoil, but nothing really changes. They just have the negative effects of psychological turmoil. So there does seem to be an element of readiness within the people who undergo transformation, almost as if, you know, who knows, maybe it's connected with previous lives. And if you believe in reincarnation, maybe it's connected with spiritual development in previous lives. Maybe this latent higher self had been built up during their previous lives. I don't know, but somehow it seems to be ready to emerge, and it naturally and spontaneously emerges in those people.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's my suspicion as well, the readiness factor, and I'd like to see it confirmed in research. I'm looking at what's interesting to me too is the content of an experience, the way it takes form, the way it, what is shown, what is learned, that it's tied to that turmoil or tied to that readiness of it to provide answers, to provide guidance perhaps. that perhaps the experience itself could be better understood in terms of that, the turmoil that one had been going through. I'm not sure, but I'm interested in that field, that area as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's I mean, it's interesting that I think it was Assagioli, you know, the transpersonal psychologist Assagioli,
Yes,
the founder of psychosynthesis.
yes.
He investigated. I think he was one of the first people to investigate the connection between spiritual awakening and psychological turmoil.
Oh,
And back in the 1960s or 1970s, and he said that there is turmoil before an awakening, and there can be turmoil after an awakening. So that, you know, there can be a period of turmoil which triggers an awakening, and then when the awakening process is very sudden and dramatic and very disruptive, there can be another period of turmoil, which is, I guess, is what we call spiritual crisis. But again, you know, the period of turmoil after the awakening usually fades away, you know, with support and guidance, and once a person has a framework to make sense of their experience.
wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Yolene.
Okay, we have another question, and this question comes from Larry. And he asks, what can you say to help someone like myself who had been going through a long dark night of the soul with spiritual awakening glimpses prior to COVID-19 and has been driven into a deeper dark night of the soul by the pandemic shutdown?
That's a difficult question. It's difficult to advise somebody without knowing more detail about their circumstances. But I would say that once you enter the dark night of the soul, it is a kind of tunnel. You know, there is always another side to. You always come out on the other side eventually. It's a natural process. The dark night of the soul is really a process of deepening, a process of further opening, a process of further losing your identity. You know, it's probably the final stage of the process where your identity fades away. And it is a process. So the process always leads towards a culmination or to a further stage. And the further stage is the light at the end of the tunnel. It's where you emerge from the process, from the dark night. But the important thing, while you're in the dark night, the important thing is to be aware that it is a temporary phase. And it's in some ways, no matter how painful it is, it's also a positive phase because it's opening you out further. It's deepening you. So you will emerge on the other side as a deeper, stronger, more spiritually open person as a result. So you need really a sense of trust and a sense of acceptance, no matter how painful it may be.
Larry said that he would come on camera. So Larry, we're gonna bring you on so you can interact. You should be coming on here in just a second. Sometimes there's a little bit of a lag time. Larry, you would need to start your video if you want to come on camera. There you are.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Oh, hi, Larry.
Hi there. God, what can I say at this point? No, thank you for your answers. Just to say a little bit more, I live in New York City by myself. As I'm sure many of you know, New York City has been especially hard hit by COVID. And so we're still in lockdown. Since I live by myself, I also have not really been employed. So I'm basically sitting by myself here in my dark night, seeking ways to go, have contact with other people who know what I'm talking about, who are sharing similar experiences, people who've gone through these experiences who can give me some kind of guidance. And now in recent weeks, I've seen people writing articles about how the whole world is going through a dark night of the soul. In this event title that had to do with the, framing it as a spiritual emergency, but I mean, dark night of the soul is a form of spiritual emergency, and it's just been, it's just squeezing so much old trauma to the surface, and I'm like so full of grief, and it's just it sometimes gets to be unbearable, but I saw this event posted online, and I jumped on it. I really wanted to be a part of this, so that's all I'll say right now.
Yeah, it's I can empathize with you, your sense of isolation, and especially if you were undergoing this period, you're going through this period before the pandemic began.
Yes.
It could have caught you at a difficult time. But I think even though it's painful, the fact that trauma is emerging, it's a sign that you are opening, that something inside you is opening up, and there is a process underway. And I think if you hang in there and just try to observe the process without being too disturbed by it, just kind of trying to allow it to happen, and trust that it is ultimately it will be a process of cleansing and opening, then whenever the period of confinement ends or the lockdown ends, then hopefully you will emerge, in a more open and spiritually deepened mode of being.
Yeah, the trust part is the most difficult aspect of it. I didn't know that people went through experiences like this before, 3 or 4 years ago. I'm just discovering all this for the first time. And, I was an ardent atheist for the longest of times until around 3 or 4 years ago when I started having spiritual awakening experiences. I've definitely been in a period of falling apart in lots of ways for a long time now.
Larry, thank you so much for coming on camera to share what you're going through with us. And we know you're not the only one struggling right now. And I just want to remind you and everyone else that we do have a support directory. If you go on our website, you can find people who are trained by us, certified by us to help with these unique challenges. And we also have a peer support community. So there's that, there are other people out there who understand. And again, thank you for showing up to share.
Oh, you're welcome, and thank you.
All right, Larry.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you.
Okay, and we have a question from Mary Frances Hoffman. Mary Frances wants to know, Steve, do you feel that these types of experiences occur during midlife more frequently? Have you found that in your research?
Yes, to some degree, because I think midlife is quite a tricky period of life. It's a period where some people begin to question the values that they've lived by. Some people may feel a sense of disappointment. Maybe they're successful in an outward way. Maybe they have done well for themselves, as we say, but maybe inside they feel a sense of emptiness, a sense of meaninglessness. And that sense of meaninglessness can provide a kind of opening, for spiritual awakening. So I think sometimes when people are younger, they have a sense of optimism. They feel that they have a role in society. But once you have played your role in society, and once you have achieved the goals of our society, and you still feel unhappy, you still feel a sense of restlessness, that can be the starting point of awakening.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I would agree with that. Okay, I think we have Sandy Briggs who's going to come on with a question.
Yes, just a moment here. Sandy on camera. Sandy, we're ready for you. You'll be popping on the screen in just a second. Hi, Sandy.
Hello there.
And
Hi, Sandy.
Sandy is
Hi.
also an assist. She's our forum administrator and a moderator. So thank you for being here today, Sandy.
Glad to be here.
Thank
I was looking forward to this session with Steve Taylor, and I wanted to know a little bit more about your experience. You said that you had one when you were 16 years old, and when you had your experience, have you heard about other experiences like these before? I think you said you didn't. Well, I'll let you explain that. And how did you learn to incorporate them and accept them as being real? Of like, we come across people who think that we're making them up, or we must have been on some kind of drug or something like that that's caused it. And so we know that they happened, but there's a lot of people get really confused because it pulls against their culture or their religion or whatever. So how did you learn how to overcome that?
Good question. Well, for a long time, I didn't overcome it because I did think that I was strange. I knew that the experiences were real because they carried a sense of authority. I think everybody knows when they have these experiences that they are real. You know, they're not hallucination. They have a sense of revelation about them. And you know that rather than perceiving an illusory reality, you're actually perceiving a more intense and more real reality. So I knew that they were real. But I thought maybe it proved that there was something wrong with me, because at that time I thought I felt different to other people anyway. I felt like an outsider. I couldn't function in the way that other people functioned. So I thought, well, this proves that there's something strange about me. I thought of myself as a kind of tortured artist, you know, who was crazy. I was a musician at that time, so I thought, well, I'm just a tortured, crazy musician. I'm going to end up dying young from a drugs overdose or something like that. But later on, it was a very important moment when I discovered a book called Mysticism at my local bookshop. It was a book called Mysticism, a Study and an Anthology. And I felt an impulse to buy it. I was probably 21 at the time. I felt an impulse to buy it, and I began to read about these mystical experiences, and I thought, wow, these are the experiences that I've had. So it felt, you know, tremendously reassuring to know that these experiences were actually fairly common. Well, at least they were not uncommon. And then I began to explore spirituality. I began to attend spiritual groups. I went to a Buddhist center and so on. So, you know, I knew that there wasn't something wrong with me. There wasn't something strange about me. There was a whole world of spirituality in which I could feel at home. And, you know, I could feel comfortable talking about these experiences to other people. I got to know other spiritual seekers and so on. So at that point, you know, it took me a few years to integrate the experiences, in the sense that it took me a while to be able to function properly in the world, you know, to be able to, you know, to hold down a job and to talk to people in a normal way. Because for a long time I was quite unusual. You know, I found social situations quite difficult to deal with. Eventually I began to integrate myself into the everyday world and to function in the everyday world. And you know, and so from that point on, life was no longer a struggle.
Would you mind sharing a little bit more detail about what your experience was?
Well, there were many of them. There were lots of them. I was very attracted to nature. I still am. You know, I love the natural world. So when I was 16, 17 years old, I would walk in my local park. I would sometimes go to my school in the evening and walk through the fields at my school. And I'd just look at the sky, look at the clouds, look at the moon and the stars. And, you know, on the one hand, I was amazed at how beautiful everything looked. And I'd also feel a sense of connection. I felt that I wasn't just in my body. I was expanding into space and connecting with the clouds and the trees and the fields and the sky. And inside me, there was a sense of euphoria, a sense of well-being. So even though, in some ways I was quite depressed and alienated, this feeling of euphoria would override my negative emotions and fill me with a tremendous sense of well-being. So I continued to have those feelings quite frequently when I was in natural surroundings. So, and it's the same now. I get similar feelings when I'm swimming in the ocean or walking in the countryside, or even just looking at the sky. I feel that same sense of connection, the same sense of expansiveness, the same sense of beauty and wonder. So for me, nature is a big part of my spiritual path, you could say.
When you started sharing your experience, did you have much trouble or difficulty with people who do not understand you?
Yeah, I mean, people would say to me, "Oh, have you been taking LSD?" Or they would look at me in a strange way. But I think after a while, you get a sense of who you can talk about with these experiences. You sort of know that there are certain people who wouldn't understand. There are certain people who would get what you're talking about. So, once you find a peer group where you can talk about these experiences, it doesn't really matter that other people don't understand, because you have your understanding from a certain set of people. But that was what I found. As soon as I had my peer group, a certain group of people with whom I could share these experiences, and it didn't matter that my parents and my family and the people I worked with or went to university with didn't understand. You don't necessarily need understanding from everybody, as long as you have some understanding from some people.
I thank you for answering these questions. Come up a lot, because of different experiences on the forum. And, I feel so, my heart reaches out to those who want to share, and when they do, they don't, they have difficulty and they get to a doctor and they will put them on medications. And then, they didn't really need to be on medications. And have you come across people like that? Do you have met that the doctors are not open to these experiences? And then
definitely, yeah, particularly in cases of sudden transformation, particularly in cases of intense psychological turmoil, when people undergo a sudden shift of identity. Now, as we know, these experiences can be sometimes quite disruptive, psychologically and even physically. And most psychiatrists don't really understand them. So, I've met a lot of people in my research who've been medicated or even been sectioned in psychiatric institutions. But I think it's interesting that in every case, I don't know if this is your experience, maybe this is hopefully your experience too, but in most cases, everybody knows that they're not crazy. They know that there are certain disturbances that they're experiencing, but they know that they're going through a positive transformational process. They know that they can't be written off as psychiatric patients. And they know that they shouldn't really be taking medication, because they know that there is this positive transformational process expressing itself inside them. So some of the people I know, they've managed to escape from psychiatric institutions. They've managed to, not take the medication because they knew that they were undergoing something positive despite the, disturbing symptoms.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks for coming on with us, Sandy.
Sure.
So, Steve, we know it's getting late there for you. We have many questions that unfortunately we're not going to get to. But
I've got another, what time? 10 minutes or so. I've got another 10 minutes or so.
All right. Well, let's go to this question we have from Samantha Stevenson. And Samantha is asking whether you have advice for integration support. She said she's having a hard time figuring out how to function in modern society post-ST.
Sorry, I didn't catch the end. Post.
STE, spiritually transformative.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, it is difficult, because the world does not function along spiritual principles. The everyday world does not function along spiritual principles. I think most, either people who are naturally spiritual, who are trying to express their innate spirituality, and people who go through spiritually transformative experiences, everybody goes through a difficult, well, most people go through a difficult period of adjustment. But there are definitely certain, steps you can take to, to negotiate the difficult period. I think one of the difficulties is that when we undergo spiritual opening or awakening, we become very sensitive. The filters seem to fall away, and we feel as though we're being bombarded with information. And that can be positive because the world becomes more beautiful to us. It becomes more real. We feel our experiences more intensely. We become more creative. But it's also difficult because we can feel overwhelmed by the amount of information. That can also happen in terms of empathy. It's quite easy to live in a separate egoic state when you're totally self-centered and you have strong boundaries. It's quite easy to live like that because you don't feel this flow of information from other people. But once the boundaries fade away, and you begin to empathize, you can feel overloaded with other people's emotions and other people's experiences. So to move on to specific guidance, it's very important to have periods of stillness where you take yourself away from any stress or noise or activity and just allow yourself to gently retreat and regenerate. And I think, in these situations, we do feel, well, there is always a kind of a natural stillness within us that we can always retreat to. We can always withdraw into the stillness at the center of our being. And once we have attuned to that stillness, then we can feel ready again to emerge and to enter into the world again. So contact with nature is really important too, because nature conveys stillness. It makes us feel at ease, and nature has a very calming effect. So again, once you've spent time in nature, you can feel ready to emerge again and to enter the world. So I'd say that you need to balance out any activity, any stress with periods of retreat and withdrawal, and trust in the natural harmony of your own being.
Oh, thank you. That sounds like good advice. I hope that helps to answer your question, Samantha. So also in terms of integration, I want to remind everyone that you can contact us if you want to join small support groups that we're offering or the private online peer support forum. You can email us at info@aciste.org. It's info@ACISTE.org. And we'd be happy to give you the information about signing up for the secure platforms where we're hosting those. And again, Steve Taylor, it's been really a wonderful conversation. I think we could keep you up all night talking about this, but we won't. But we're really grateful for your continuing work in this field and all that you're doing to help give all of us a context for what we're experiencing. And we really trust that the world is changing and readying and embracing this. And we're grateful to have your work guiding us. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the work you're doing is amazing too, because as I said before, one of the most important things is to provide support and guidance for people who are undergoing these experiences. That can mean the difference between, a successful transition into spiritual awakening and a further period of discord and suffering. So yeah, I think you're providing that context and support, which is really, really important for people.
Yes.
So yes, I look forward to working more closely together with you. That'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, we certainly look forward to being in touch more. And again, for anybody else who is interested, you can email us at info@ACISTE.org. And Steve, what is the website that people can reach you easily at and find out more about your work?
My personal website is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. So many of my papers and also I write poems. Some of my poems are on there and lots of other materials. And people can also contact me through the website.
Perfect. Beautiful. Okay, and for anyone out there who may be interested in joining our virtual conference this year, we're moving it online. It's going to be live on October 9th and 10th of 2020, and we're currently accepting proposals. If you want to present your research with us, or if you have some clinical experience you'd like to share, please email us again at info@acist.org, and we can give you more information on that. And Steve, thank you again.
You're welcome. It's been great to talk to you.
Yep. All right. Thank you so much for joining us from all the way from England and so late at night. And blessings to you and your continued success in your work.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yep.
Same to you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.